We have a fantastic panel exploring the intersection of intellectual property and blockchain, distributed ledger technology, and other technological innovations. There's one person listed, it may not be listed, but there was another person who is an alumnus of this law school, Alex Chan. He works for Tensegrity Law out in San Diego. Unfortunately, he was unable to make it because of a personal emergency. But I wanted to just mention him and acknowledge that he was going to be a fantastic part of this presentation as well. But we still have a very esteemed panel of folks from all different sectors of intellectual property. And so we have, to my immediate left, Dan Bork, the CTO of IPwe. He is a technology executive. He has considerable and vast expertise over 20 years. He looks super young, so he started early. And he'll talk more about that. I'm not going to steal the thunder of what everyone on the panel is going to talk about, but just to set the stage, we have Maureen Murat from Crowdie Advisors. She's of counsel to Cognate Law Group and a chief advisor at Crowdie Advisors. Works on crowdfunding. She's a Jobs Act expert. She's a lawyer, barred in Florida and New York. And she's also an entrepreneur with over 15 years of legal industry experience. She's fluent in legalese, and she's learned she describes it as learning how to cut through the gray. I call it BS, and I'm being filmed, so that's cool too, especially in the blockchain space. We have Jeremey Kauffman, who's the CEO of LBRY. Super excited about that project too, and it's one that's from this region as well. I'm excited for him to tell you more about LBRY. He is a very cool nerd. He holds a degree both in computer science and physics from RPI, and I look forward to his comments. And then finally, we have Bennett Collen. He's the CEO of Cognate. He's the son of two trademark attorneys, and so we make him an unofficial JD. That's super cool. I could have done that instead. Right. He's the coordinator of the blockchain task force for the Emerging Issues Committee of INTA. So for those of you in the trademark space, you'll be familiar with that as well. He also sits on the Blockchain Intellectual Property Council for the Digital Chamber of Commerce, and he's a founding member of the Chamber's Token Alliance Group. And so we have a considerable wealth of information here, and this is an area that I work in now. I fell down the rabbit hole of blockchain, distributed ledger technology, and cryptocurrencies a little while ago, and a little while in blockchain, I don't know, 18 months is like 5 years. Right. So it'll be very interesting to see how this intersects and to come at it from a number of different points. I wanted to tee up the discussion in lieu of Alex's absence to just give about 10-minute overview of the technology, kind of set the stage for the discussion that will follow. So we're going to be using a number of terms that sometimes we think are super clear that are not. And so I'll be going through kind of at a rapid clip to leave sufficient time for the true experts sitting at the table. But it is important to kind of figure out what this technology is and set the stage for the intellectual property issues that I will raise and that we'll explore with each panelist. So I'll cover what blockchain is, its original origin, its use cases, talk a tiny bit about cryptocurrencies because that's not the focus of this panel. But just to know that Bitcoin was the first, and you have altcoins related there, and also other platforms. When we say blockchain, there are many blockchains, and also distributed ledger technologies is a broader issue for another day. But what will ultimately also become relevant is this concept of smart contracts. When I say smart contracts, my legal brain hurts because we immediately go back to first-year contracts. But it's important to understand from a technologist perspective what that means. Simple bits of code that are programmable and self-executing. And then a few of the IP issues that I'll list that we'll talk more about in panel. So just to tee up the importance and the impact of blockchain, so some statistics, one from the World Economic Forum, that 10% of global GDP will be stored using blockchain by 2027. From Deloitte Insights, blockchain technology's business value add will grow to 176 billion with a B by 2025. And finally, from Statista FinTech report, recent report, that the global blockchain technology market is predicted to reach almost 340 million USD in size and grow to 2.3 billion by 2021. So it's not a matter of if, but when. It's also, as my esteemed colleague Samson Williams says, it ain't hot sauce, you can't put it on everything. But it is important that we know the issues and that we're able to explore it, and we can speak with clients and with students to prepare them to have the discussion. Part of the competence to practice law is being technologically competent as well. So it's critically important that in every discipline, because this is such a pervasive tool, a technological tool, that we have to understand its impact in our particular field. I love this quote from Don and Alex Tapscott, because what we're really talking about is blockchain, Web 3.0. And I'll kind of take us through, most of us in this room will understand the iterations of the web from 1.0, 2.0, and now 3.0, but what that really means is that we are talking about the internet of value. We spent a lot of time, or corporations on our behalf and without our knowledge, but we certainly gave consent, building these databases of extraordinary data. We're now in a Web 3.0 world where we can talk about it as the transfer or the internet of value, and we will certainly be talking about that from an intellectual property context as well. I wanted to give you a working definition. This is a definition, and I teach blockchain and the law through our upcoming non-JD certificate program that covers blockchain cryptocurrencies in the law. And what I say in that class is that we're going to start with a definition, and it's going to change literally every time I talk to you. So we'll just write it down now, and then we'll erase it later. Are there erasers? I don't know. You'll delete it. But we have to have a working definition. But well played, well played. Pipe down. We already have our first heckler, told you. But blockchains are, and I've highlighted some terms that are important in this space, decentralized databases. We could go on and on for 14 weeks just about that, but we won't. Maintained by a distributed network of computers that rely on network effects and economic incentives to secure the network. And so I like that as a starting point to have some grounding in the foundation as we move forward. As I mentioned, this idea of the 3 stages of computer network revolution, where you have this centralized client-server model, and that early iteration of the web. We also look at it as end users being really recipients, passive recipients. They weren't dynamically involved or socially involved in web spaces. And it's visiting a website and consuming information, but not interacting either with the information or with other peers. And then we move to Web 2.0 when we think about the decentralized structure that we've come to know and love at this point, and maybe not love so much, which leads us to Web 3.0. But we have many stop points, many intermediaries running networks that are, or communities, net communities that are connected together in the way that you see defined there. And then this idea of fully distributed, where it's the disintermediation of everything that is done on the net in its purest or ideal form. When we talk about blockchains, and each person that has a blockchain project, hopefully they'll make clear whether we're talking about a fully distributed, public, permissionless blockchain, or some type of consortium, or purely private, because it makes a difference. And that's important. But when I'm moving through these slides, I'm thinking of a public, fully permissionless chain. Where did it come from? This awesome woman named Satoshi Nakamoto. She's amazing. We don't know who Satoshi is. Many people have fun guessing who that might be, a person, a group of people, but it is interesting, and it's part of the folklore that's kind of magical. The original blockchain is the Bitcoin blockchain, as was mentioned, and Satoshi dropped this paper, this white paper, 9-page white paper, has fewer than 10 footnotes, I believe, so we are all doing something extremely wrong, because that white paper changed the world. I think, he, she, they said, it doesn't take all that, here's the idea. So that was written in 2008, 2009, the Bitcoin blockchain was released to the world with no intermediary governing it. It's executing at this point. The reason that Satoshi created it was to avoid this idea of the double spend problem, that because of, even though we have this digital veneer of how we interact with money, and there are more than a few people in this audience who probably, they have a lot of money in the bank, I think, but probably not on you, because who does that, right? So this idea that if I send money to a person, my bank has to reconcile on its end, and the other bank has to reconcile on that end, and we have all these intermediaries between the transfer of value as between us. So this digital veneer is really hiding the age-old system that we have, and so the idea was to resolve for that. The first use case is digital money or digital currency. There's some core technological components that I want you to focus on before we get into our comments. One of the many things I love about this area is that these tools have been around for decades. Peer-to-peer technology at this point, the internet, PPK, public-private key cryptography and digital signature, they've been around for decades. Right. But it's this interesting and unique and novel way that they are working together to actually solve for some of the issues in a Web 2.0 world from an entertainment perspective. So in the copy and paste culture where you can make a perfect digital image or copy, I should say, of something and send it to thousands of your closest or not so close friends in a peer-to-peer world, actually the technology is being used now to do an end run and actually empower entertainers, creators. We're going to talk about that a bit as we move forward. So I like that idea about it as well. The core characteristics, this idea of consensus mechanisms, which we could also go on and on about for a good 14 weeks or 14 years, but it's market-based game theory. We have this app-end only nature of a blockchain. You can add to it, but you can't delete, as Steve noted. We have the disintermediation of relationships, so removing the middle person from transactions, and that's kind of the peer-to-peer part. And this idea that it's transnational, so it's borderless, which also makes it, raises some core concerns that we talk about as well. So if we have all those technological characteristics, if there's no central point of accountability and a lack of geographical boundaries, that makes blockchains really difficult to govern. Ask a legislator who, first of all, is trying to understand and grapple with what that means, and then try to regulate it. And regulate what? The tool. Intermediaries is what we did in the internet world, right? We'll just find the big guys, the ISPs, the OSPs, and we'll regulate in that space. What happens when you don't have one? The app-end only nature makes it difficult to change, clearly, unless that's hardwired or coded, I should say, into the code at the outset. Because once it's on its way, who do we call to turn it off? Pseudonymous. It is a misnomer to talk about most blockchains as being anonymous. It's pseudonymous. Ask any law enforcement personnel that's found their way to people who are defrauding others or involved in illicit or criminal activity. It's the same idea of following the money is following the public key. You can put together a whole string. So it's actually pretty bad if you plan on using it for illicit purposes. That's not legal advice. I'm just telling you what I know. And then we have something, the idea that it's transparent, it's traceable, as I'm talking about, gives plenty of concerns about privacy and what that means. So I did a presentation for a medical group, and they're very interested about the concept of using blockchain technology for certain things, but then you come up against HIPAA or GDPR, all these issues that are out in the world about privacy. And that's where consortium chains and other things come on. Blockchain mechanics, and I'm going to sit down and we'll have our other conversation. I look at it this way. I've distilled all of blockchain into one slide, maybe two. Think of it first as a digital spreadsheet of transactions that's shared across a network of computers. We're all familiar with networks and computers. Some of the language that's important in this space is that each computer that runs a full version of a blockchain's software is called a node. New transactions on blockchains are broadcast to the network, and they're verified by each node. You don't have to participate in a network as a node if you don't want to. I could have a Bitcoin wallet. Dan has a Bitcoin wallet, and we can exchange right here. But to the extent that you run the full version of the software, then your computer would be designated as a node. I'm speaking in truly broad brushes here because there are a lot of nuances to the specifics of a specific chain. We're hitting the high notes here. All of the verified transactions, and this is all done by the software, transactions broadcast. Okay, Tonya sent 2 Bitcoin to Samson. Not really, don't even look, didn't happen. But let's say it did. Tonya sent 2 Bitcoin to Samson. Tonya has 2 Bitcoin. There might be some other rules for the protocol. The software is checking the boxes to make sure that's true, and every single node in the network does the same. That's where that consensus building comes in. There are a number of different ways to build consensus. Proof of work is probably the most prominent. Also has great concerns about the computational power that's used in energy. We could do a whole thing on environmental law on it as well. Another is proof of stake, and there are many interesting models for that. Each group of verified transactions is called a block. You might think of it as this transactions that go on if you're a business and at the end of the day, maybe you're making a settlement. So transactions are being verified. Does this person have the money? You're grouping or batching them all together, and a certain number of verified transactions will be recorded in one specific block. New blocks are added to the chain by a special type of node known as a miner. It's analogous. The idea is that someone goes out and is digging for gold and then you find it. It's sometimes a bit of a misnomer, but miners are competing to solve this important mathematical equation related to hashing. And the winner, whichever miner is the first to solve this equation, is awarded with what's called a block reward. So for the Bitcoin blockchain, that's still 12.5, started at 50, and you have these halving events every 4 years or so from 50 to 25 to 12.5, and you can continue to do the math. That's not my specialty. But that person, that entity that mines successfully, and they get the block reward, and a new block is added to the chain. And how we get to blockchain is blocks are interrelated because each block contains part of the previous block's data. And so the final point that I'll make here to get a visual of how it might look, and don't worry about Merkle root, we're not going there today. But we have at the lowest level here, the block 1 transactions that are all grouped together. They're verified, waiting to be added as a new block to the chain. That is reduced down to a single alphanumeric string of numbers. That is added to or combined with the hash or the numbers of the previous block. And therefore, if I wanted to change block 1, I'd have to go back to the Genesis block and do that. And with each block that's added, it gets increasingly more difficult to do that. It's not impossible. We're not talking about 51% attacks unless somebody's experienced that. I hope you have not read that. But as you can see, that then goes to the next block 2 and then block 3 and so on. And so that's basically the way the technology works and is structured. And then we will start, Dan actually will start with IPwe, and we'll say, based upon that general overview, what each of the projects is doing, and then Maureen is going to add in what's going on kind of in entertainment and media and some of the use cases there. Okay? Excellent.
Great, so I'll talk a little bit about how IPwe approaches this. So IPwe is trying to create a financial asset out of a patent, and that's what our goal is. And there's really 3 main problems that are in the marketplace right now to do that. The first one being ownership of a patent, who actually owns the patent. Second problem is trying to at least identify what a patent is about without having tons of technical experts about that particular patent. And the third piece is understanding what the value of the patent is without having to go through litigation to find out what that amount is. So the first and sort of the core problem of patent transactions is ownership. And so blockchain fits in sort of perfectly for patent ownership. So what we're doing is we're creating the first global patent registry. And in doing that, we're creating and she talked about it before, Tonya talked about it, about a permission blockchain versus a permissionless blockchain. So ours is a permission blockchain. You have to be permissioned to be on our particular blockchain network. And so what we do is we verify not only the user of the system and the company they're representing, but then we also verify the ownership of that patent. That goes on as a block, as ownership onto the Global Patent Registry. And then once that's established, you can begin to do transactions on the registry. You can You can offer that patent for license, you can offer that patent for sale, but it's traceable then back to that particular ownership transaction. In terms of understanding what the patent's about, another topic of this panel is AI. So we've spent the last 10 years indexing 91 patent offices' patents, their full text, their claim elements, their network connections in terms of their citation network as well as their classification network. And so we've come up with a set of algorithms that can sort of group patents together within technologies. We can do some pretty sophisticated claim element to prior art matching for validity. So we can give some general overviews of patents about whether or not they're, we can give a metric for validity, we can give a metric for the quality of prosecution based on a number of different elements about the patent, which again helps the marketplace understand what they're looking at when they're potentially transacting a patent. And then finally, when you transact the patent, you can put that on the blockchain, and you can learn a lot about the patents that are on the blockchain by putting things like annuity payments onto the blockchain, or any litigation about the patent on the blockchain, any licenses on the blockchain. We also realize that privacy is also an issue with our customers. So part of being a permission blockchain, in the particular blockchain that we use, Hyperledger Fabric, it allows us to do private channels between companies. So we can keep that information confidential between two parties that are transacting on the patent, yet we can at least expose the fact that there might be a number of licenses for a particular patent, but the actual details of the license can be private between two parties on that blockchain. And that's some of the benefits that you get with a permission blockchain, is that you can keep certain pieces of information private while you can make others of it public for sort of the public and for the market use for that. So that's how IPwe is using blockchain.
Excellent. And for library?
Yes. I guess everyone can hear me. Yeah, can hear me fine. So first I want to say credit to Tonya. That was a really great introduction. I see a lot of bad ones, and that one was very good. Yeah, like that's about as it is, especially for how densely you did it. Really fantastic, and you hit a lot of the key emphasis that I think are important in terms of like what is a blockchain. Well, first and foremost, it's a database. Like that is the word to map it onto, and what's different about it is the ability to reach consensus agreement on what's in that database without having a single point of failure, without having it, or a single entity that's in charge of it. And that's that to me is what's novel about blockchain. Tonya emphasized this as well, that's a big difference between public and permissioned chains. And I think it's very important when you're looking at blockchain companies to make sure that you're understanding what type of blockchain that they are talking about. They both have their use cases, but they're very different technologies in terms of how that plays out. So LBRY is a public blockchain. It's its own blockchain. So we're not on Ethereum. We're not on anything else. It's its own public blockchain. And what we use our blockchain and really our protocol to do is to facilitate the discovery, distribution, and purchase of digital content. Another way of putting that is we want to have a protocol that provides everything that an iTunes or a YouTube or these other kinds of services do. So via our protocol and the applications that interact with our protocol, you can have a user experience that is very comparable to these services, but what's different about it is that it's all on top of open source technologies that are protocol based rather than a distinct and specific platform. And just as Tonya said, this is the sort of Web 3.0 of these Web 2.0 technologies. Why does this distinction matter, a protocol versus a platform? So I'll talk about the general case, and then I'll talk about the specifics of our company. So in the general case, it's a lot of it's about trust and permission. So when things are based on top of a protocol, it's basically a check on the company's behavior. The company can't be too big of a jerk. So if we look at technologies like Gmail is an email client, but it's on top of an email protocol. So if Gmail ever starts to behave in a way that is too aggressive to the customers, it's actually pretty easy to get out of Gmail. You can export all of your email, you can switch to Outlook, you can switch to Thunderbird, you can switch to another thing, and you've got all of your stuff with you. You can't do that on Facebook, you can't do that on YouTube, you can't do that on these other services because they're not protocols, they're centralized services. And so that's a big part of what our company is trying to do, and that's part of the business proposition, is that you can trust building on top of this a lot more. Another part of the business proposition specific to our case is the margins taken by the middlemen in the case of digital content distribution are shockingly high. If I sell a good on something like eBay, I'm losing 5–10% of the price. If I sell a digital good, which we should think should be a lot easier to distribute than mailing something, I'm losing 30, 40, 50%. And that's kind of crazy, and that's a signal to me as an entrepreneur to say, hey, maybe that's an opportunity. So that's what our company is trying to do. I'll talk a little bit about where we are. Our blockchain has been live for about 3 years. We have 20 people working full time at the company. We've had over 200,000 people use our software to access and watch content. You can watch everything from popular streamers to Hollywood videos. And there's over 500,000 pieces of content on the network, and there's about 1,000 or so being added every day right now. This is, and also in the blockchain space, you run into a lot of these, I have a white paper, or I have an idea, or whatever. This is a live platform. You can use it, you can run it right now, and everyone can do this. It is still, definitely still a field where the technology is still a little bit rough around the edges. When I say we're trying to match these experiences, I wouldn't say we're exactly there yet, but we're getting closer every day, and I think that we will reach that future. In terms of how this is interesting from a legal perspective, blockchain and legal stuff is just so interesting to me because not even getting into our company, just the general idea, we have this service, this emergent service that Bitcoin is able to provide that no bank could provide, right? It would be no bank in the United States could say, I'm going to provide anonymous cash bank accounts that are with irreversible transfers, no KYC, no AML, right? No know your customer, anti-money laundering. None of these, right? Somehow we have all these regulations that would apply if a bank was doing this, but because it's Bitcoin, it exists. And so I just find this just fascinating. Right, and this problem is going to apply to a lot of different things. It's not just in that space. And so in the case of our company, right, we have laws like the DMCA, the CDA that apply to us as a technology company. But these laws, in terms of how they intersect with blockchain, is quite questionable. So I spent a lot of money on lawyers to tell me they don't know the answer. But I can now repeat just how much they don't know the answer to you guys, and you won't have to spend that money. So I already heard from the earlier conversations, from these earlier panels, there's a lot of people here who are much better at law than I am, so hopefully I will get it correct. That's, I think, a lot of what I can contribute is specifically how do the DMCA, the CDA, these laws, so Digital Millennium Copyright Act and the Communications Decency Act, which covers a lot of the ways of platforms like YouTube and Facebook work on the internet. How do these apply to these kinds of blockchains and decentralized platforms? That's a lot of what my company has to deal with. And how will these technologies affect IP, which is less of a legal question and more of just a kind of like theoretical consideration, but certainly something I've thought a lot about.
Excellent. What we'll do is hear from Bennett about Cognate, and then come to Maureen to talk about some of those overview issues related to media and entertainment. And I'll pitch out a few questions, and I have some things, but I suspect that there are a lot of questions here. And so I think a more organic conversation when I kind of tee it up, and if you have questions, to be more interactive and spend a lot of time there. So let's hear about Cognate.
Sure. So I'm Bennett Collen. I'm the founder of a company called Cognate, and we use blockchain to help businesses protect their trademark rights. It's actually really similar to what Dan and IPwe are doing for patents, except on the trademark side. So in essence, what we do is take all the relevant information about a trademark, who owns it, where, when, and how it's being used, and most importantly, proof of use information, and we put that on the blockchain, so there is a time-stamped, immutable record associated with the proof of use documentation, and the trademark is represented as a digital asset. So you can think of it as one unifying address that shows the entire usage and ownership history in association with the trademark. So you have the original, if the company's with us from its inception, you have the original data first use with an unquestionable timestamp, and then subsequent proof documents. You build out this timeline that shows unequivocally how the mark was used, in which jurisdictions it was being used, which classifications it was being used. So it's this really strong record of usage and ownership. And one of the things we added recently was being able to tie a federal registration status to these proof of use documentation. So you can say it's registered in the U.S. and Canada and the U.K. And here's our proof of use documentation associated with our use within those jurisdictions. So you really get a full picture of what the trademark is and where it owns rights. And what we want to do in the future and what we're looking towards is, again, very similar to what Dan's company is doing, is really having people think of the trademark as an asset that can be transacted with via blockchain. So you can license it, you can sell it, you can even lease it to another company in association with a domain name. I won't go into too much detail there, but essentially getting people to be able to profit from these assets. And I think trademarks are really often undervalued as an asset class, because when people think of intellectual property, they tend to think of patents, right? They think of these huge patent portfolios that a lot of companies own, that that's their valuable intellectual property. But for the vast majority of businesses, which are small businesses, most businesses are small businesses, the trademark or their brand is really the most important thing that they own, because if they can't communicate with their customers and sell their goods or services under the trademarks that they are using to sell their goods or services, they're really sunk. And they're not sitting on valuable patent portfolio. It's really their brand that's most important to them. So what we want to do is make trademark protection easier to understand, how you protect your marks, what are the things you need to do, and B, easier to profit from. So if someone is using a mark for a particular period of time, they're no longer using it, especially if it's an unregistered mark here in the US, there's really no good system right now to show who has an unregistered trademark, and there's no accepted system to sell them, right? The vast majority of businesses have no idea that unregistered trademark rights even exist, right? So being able to sell the goodwill that you've built and common law trademark rights by having it explicitly represented and the ownership and usage information documented in the blockchain, and have that be transferable or licensable via blockchain is really exciting to us, because we think it can encompass the much greater percentage of actual marks that are in use around the world, as opposed to just the federally registered trademarks within the United States and abroad. So what we are currently working on is, we were just acquired by GoDaddy. So we are working within their ecosystem to roll this out to all of their small business customers to help them capture proof of use from their websites, which we're really excited about. And we were built on top of the Ethereum blockchain, which is a public blockchain, and we thought that was an important decision to make, because we thought that provided the most trustless timestamps for the proof of use documentation. So without getting into too much technical detail, we take a hash of the image of the proof of use documentation and log it in the blockchain. And if we had a permission blockchain, we didn't think that there would be really a compelling enough reason to trust our timestamps unless we built out a pretty big and sizable consortium of other participating nodes. So we thought that the public blockchain was the best way to go, to have this immutable, trustless timestamp associated with the proof of use documentation. So that's where we were. That might change a little bit within GoDaddy. We're still trying to figure out what exactly that means, but the central mission and the overall thesis of having this one essentially blockchain address that can communicate the entirety of the ownership and usage history of a trademark is still what we're going for.
Excellent, excellent. All right, Maureen, what's going on in the world of entertainment and media?
So I think I was the only one that prepared slides. But I'll go through them quickly, because I did also have examples, but you've all given my examples. So we won't even talk about those. Let me just... Here we go. Okay, so one thing that we kind of brushed over earlier in Tonya's introduction was that in terms of the Bitcoin blockchain, initially it was set out to put financial transactions on a blockchain. And so it was mainly about FinTech. Oh, sorry, I didn't do the slideshow. Thank you. Thank you. So FinTech solutions, right? Peer-to-peer payments, maybe even transferring of wealth and things like that. Those were all what, let's say, the initial blockchain was essentially intended to do. But over time, people have realized that the actual technology, the fact that you can have this data on this blockchain, that you can have a record of this blockchain, that you can possibly, you know, create smart contracts to have these different conditions, and when these different conditions are met, then you make them, the smart contract can kind of automate some of the processes. So now we have something that's beyond FinTech, right? And we're saying that some of those things include entertainment and media. So I won't go too much into these because, like I said, they've all, our other panelists here have talked about some of the things that...
repetition breeds retention.
Okay.
I say things 7 times and I'm mortified sometimes by the exams. I'm just
All
saying.
right. All right. So here's some of the possible blockchain use cases. And even though there are plenty of use cases, we see that there are also actual uses or utility of these types of this type of technology in this industry. But one of the things that, or some of the use cases that we consider when we're thinking about IP-related blockchain uses are, you know, evidence of creatorship, or even registering your IP rights or clearing your IP rights. Also, one of the big things I think is transmitting payments and royalties, which kind of ties into FinTech solutions, because that's okay. So we also want to keep that in mind, that even though a lot of this technology has, you know, these use cases, we also have actual uses as well. So some of the, I think one of the things that we have to also consider is that pain points spur innovation, right? And so when we think of some of the pain points that creators, IP aggregators, and people who own trademarks or patents experience, then it kind of breeds for this need for innovation to make things either cheaper, easier, faster, more accessible, et cetera. And so these are some of the industries that I think will be disrupted the most by blockchain, which will be the ability to use and track and enforce rights in terms of digital content, whether it be music or books. Micropayments, so yes, I can go on Spotify and probably purchase an album or a song off of an album that I like, but can I use, if I have Ethereum or Ether, I should say, or Bitcoin, can I use that to pay for it? No, I can't do that on Spotify, but I could probably do it on IPwe, or I could do it on one of the other platforms. And so I gave examples, and I won't use these examples because they are all but essentially some of the other companies that are out there are providing ways to record ownership. They're also providing ways for authors to either publish their work and maybe charge fees and not have to go necessarily through a publisher, or not have to go through this intermediary to be able to share their work with the world. And I think that's one of the main benefits of blockchain, the fact that you can have this direct relationship with your consumers without, you know, licensing software, without a digital music content provider, or without even a bank, right? So if I am an artist and there are 3 other people on this song that we've written, I wrote it, somebody did the music, somebody else did, you know, something else that created this content, then when it's time to sell it, when the royalties are being split, we don't necessarily have to go through this IP aggregator to wait for the check, and then when we get the check or wire or whatnot, then we have to wait till it hits the bank, and then you have to wait 3 to 5 business days for it to clear, et cetera. And whereas you can use blockchain and cryptocurrencies, or however you want to facilitate this transaction, to make it so that it's quicker and easier and more transparent. And I know there was a word of trustless bouncing around. I think that in a way, it's kind of a misnomer because there is some level of trust there. It's just that it's not necessarily in an intermediary. I think the trust now is in the actual code or the protocol that when this happens, then we can expect this next thing to happen. And we know that someone can't say, oops, I messed up, and then try to go and modify it because it's resistant to modification, which is also very helpful when it comes to digital content and information that we feel should be on this blockchain, made public, et cetera. And to Tonya's point earlier, not everything necessarily needs to be on a blockchain, but I think there's benefit in knowing that this thing exists and that there is some value to it that could potentially, help whatever your business industry is. So some of the challenges, because we all like to talk about how great blockchain is, some of the challenges, one is adoption. And I think the issue with adoption is that because it's kind of clunky and there are a lot of gray areas and there are lots of buzzwords going about, that it's not really clear what I should be accepting or adopting about this technology. Another thing is intermediaries. I think intermediaries will have to find a way to either join the club and figure out how this could work for whatever they're providing, or they, may suffer the consequences. And I'll give you an example. Does anybody remember Blockbuster? Right? So, and we see what happened there. Their reluctance to adapt essentially killed them. And so private and public blockchains, we've talked about that. We've also talked about permissioned and permissionless blockchains, and you can kind of mix them, if you will. So you can have a private blockchain that is permissioned, or you can have a public blockchain that is permissionless. So I'm saying that to say that just because you have a private blockchain doesn't mean it's permissioned, because you can kind of mix up the access to the blockchain. Another issue is education, awareness, and policies. And I guess that kind of ties into adoption and even how IP disputes will be handled, because even though this technology is, moving at great speed, our legal system hasn't quite caught up. And so if you say that you have this smart contract that said that they were supposed to do this, and someone disputes that it's not how you thought it was going to be, et cetera, we don't necessarily have a system to say that, we can acknowledge that this smart contract meant something, or that we could use this as some form of evidence or some form of proof that whatever it was expected to happen actually happens. There are some states that recognize smart contracts or even recognize timestamps or entries onto a blockchain, that data exists on a blockchain, but there are very few of those states, like Wyoming and Tennessee, and so and nobody lives in Wyoming, or I don't know how many people go to Wyoming. Not against Wyoming, if there are any people from Wyoming, but I'm just saying. You have to keep in mind that you also have to meet the people where they are, and most businesses right now are probably registering in Delaware or where they're actually headquartered. So I think that's something else to consider. So in the end, I think the technology is definitely something that we should be cognizant of in terms of the benefits and some of the drawbacks, because I think we also mentioned that you have to mine a lot of this data, and so mining is a very expensive and labor-intensive process. But I think the fact that everyday people can even be involved in that process is something that you might not have been able to imagine from just using the internet, right? And we also have to be, I think, mindful that a lot of this stuff couldn't happen without some of the structures or the infrastructure that we already have, right? So you need the internet to make this work. You need to be able to access the internet, which is another big problem that we have in the world, right? There are so many people who don't even have access to internet. And in big cities, even though DC is not a big city, but places in the nation's capital, people don't have access to internet. So it's like, if I don't have access to internet, how could I even really be able to find ways to use this technology to my benefit if at the basic level I don't have access. So that's all I think I'll say about that. But I think, one last thing. In terms of how entertainment and media is being disrupted by some of these technologies. I think another thing is that creators are not necessarily at whim of being accepted by this one person to say, okay, yes, your thing is marketable, or your product is something that, you know, we could probably make some money off of. So people can directly, you know, sell their products or their content to others and reap the benefits, you know, in a quicker manner. So that's all. Oops.
Thank you.
I think that's it.
So I'm going to float a couple of questions and then we'll open it up for audience participation. I have a couple of questions specific and then some general questions for the entire panel. I'm wondering about, maybe Dan, you can start with this, how you think blockchain strengthens or weakens digital IP enforcement. Enforcement is such a big issue for on the trademark side, certainly, and the patent side. And so we're always talking about the creation of the asset, but then the enforcement and monitoring of the asset is a completely different enterprise, and there's some a number of reasons, important reasons why owners will have to do that. So how does your technology play into that?
Yeah, and it obviously I think helps in the enforcement for that, especially if there's, you know, immutable records of agreements for licensing, for instance. We also think that as blockchain progresses as a technology, more and more companies are going to be using blockchain from a supply chain perspective and things like that. And you can imagine that if you have patents that represent, you know, a product or a part or things like that, there's going to be immutable records of those usage in supply chains that you could plug in a blockchain to for royalty payments, for instance, and things like that. So we think it's going to be nothing but helpful for enforcement of those type of licensing rights.
Bennett, would you agree?
Yeah, I obviously think that the more clear documentation you can have, the better, and the fact that you're using a technology that makes the records really difficult to dispute, if not impossible, or mathematically impossible to dispute, I think definitely will help. Some of the things that we think about are if you are using a more open source and permissionless system, how do you regulate what information is going into that system, especially in an IP setting? Like ownership is a huge issue. I mean, Dan and I were just chatting before the panel started on how you verify ownership. That's something that's really going to be hairy to figure out, but really important in protecting trademark rights, especially if this IP register becomes the record that people refer to. How are you ensuring that the information that gets on there is valid and the rightful owners are making records about the usage or ownership of the intellectual property without putting in some sort of intermediary? If we can streamline those verification processes, I think that's going to be something to figure out. And actually something I would love to hear from the attorneys in the room in terms of enforcement is how you think e-sign laws relate to blockchain records, because that's something that we were banking on pretty heavily, is that there would be a correlation there, and that we would be able to say these are digital records, they should be just as enforceable. Just because they're in a blockchain should make them stronger, if anything, than a traditional digital record. So that's something that we thought about a lot too when people said, how will you know that this will be enforceable? So,
Jeremey, I know that we communicated by email about this topic too, so I know that you might have some thoughts about it.
I think so I think you need to differentiate between the enforcement of digital IP and non-digital IP. So I think in the case of trademarks and so on and patents, I would be inclined to agree that I don't really see how it could have a negative effect. In the case of digital IP, I think it probably also strengthens it, but I think the impacts are a little more questionable.
I would just say that I agree that I think it would be helpful, but the people you have to convince that this would be helpful is where the issues will be.
Right. No, that makes sense. That makes sense. I'm thinking about so many. This is the other thing that's come up in the conference as well about the incentives to produce intellectual property. I'm a creative person as well, so I didn't need rights to inspire me to produce. Whether or not I was going to share something different. I'm a Gen Xer, I don't like to share, but evidently millennials, they love to share. Gen Z, taking it to the next level. But I'm wondering what the panel's thoughts are in terms of how blockchain generally, or maybe your system in particular, either encourages the production or may limit in some regard, or if you're agnostic about the topic altogether.
I'll start. Not that we're agnostic, but I think we're looking at as our platform is, especially for entities like universities and things like that, that consistently produce intellectual property, but maybe aren't as experienced to get that into the marketplace to actually generate any kind of revenue for that. I mean, that's where we think that having a platform that's sort of open, transparent, and more easy to use to get intellectual property into the marketplace, I mean, it can help those that have the intellectual property, get more visibility into it and perhaps transact on it. Whether or not that, leads to, people pre-idea, coming up with more content, we certainly would like to think that if there was a marketplace for it, it would encourage more people that were even just individual inventors to go do that. But that's, I think, how we see it.
I think people who want to use blockchain also, they use it because there's an incentive to use it, right? There's some incentive model, aside from sharing content, but, including the fact that you could potentially, aggregate altcoins and cryptos, even though we don't really want to go too far deep into that conversation. But I think that gives people an incentive to even think about using blockchain to share any data or content.
This is another one where I could probably try to make arguments from both sides. So we've seen and this is more about digital content, because that's what I think about. So when we're talking about patents and trademarks, I'm probably less sure. So my answer should be considered to be thinking about digital content. But we've kind of seen that when it comes to production of digital content, as distribution costs have fallen, it's actually become more of a winner-take-all market. We could look at journalism as an example of this, where you used to get your newspaper locally, so you didn't have national distribution. Now anyone in the world can publish something instantly to everyone else in the world, and we. For right or wrong, it's possible that we have an oversupply of the production of journalism, because now the good that is journalism can be distributed much more massively, much more freely, and so that's why that's kind of why the industry is getting killed. So that you could look at that and say, well, that's actually kind of disincentivized the production of journalism. On the other hand, you could look at technologies like YouTube and go, well, oh my gosh, we have so many more people producing IP than ever were. Maybe these people were just, we're now recording conversations and sharing them that people used to just be having with their friends, and so that's more IP. So I think that blockchain is another step along these lines. Like, I think you're talking about something that is even more permissionless and even more, or as global as other internet platforms would be. I think it can have effects on both sides, where it can potentially make it more winner-take-all, but can also potentially incentivize more user-generated content and more content to be created in the first place.
I think in that vein, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is scalability, right? Because
I just typed that.
Yeah.
It's like, yes, about this.
yeah, because I agree with you wholeheartedly, and especially with all the content creation that's happening. If you can marry that with micropayments, there's a lot of goodness that can happen there. But if you're going to have all of this content that's being created all the time, I forget what it is, but like every 4 hours we create more content than ever existed in the first, 10,000 years of written history, or whatever the case was.
Wow.
If you can marry that with the micropayments, it's going to be great for the content producers, but obviously there's huge scalability problems that have to be solved there.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So if you're talking about a blockchain as a payment network, that's basically an unsolved problem as far as I'm concerned in terms of how these networks are going to scale. One thing to clarify there is they do scale for purposes of discovery. So if we want, and that LBRY is trying to do both, and so it is kind of an open question that if we have millions of people using it, how it will scale for payments, because no one really knows the answer to this. As discovery, though, it does scale quite well. So we can have a global blockchain that is sort of this register of what exists. And so maybe the payments don't have to happen on chain as we scale. Maybe we go back to using traditional payment mechanisms. But certainly for discovery, and that's kind of a novel and cool thing, is that we can have this register of what exists that anyone can contribute to, but that's not, we don't have to trust a single government or a single corporation to maintain it. And I do think that's pretty cool.
I think it makes me think of the fact that blockchain isn't necessarily meant for everything. So even if you have a process, there's no clear, bright line rule that says if you use blockchain, you have to use it throughout your whole process, right? There are ways where you can kind of use it to make certain aspects of your process more efficient, and then you still, like you said, instead of taking payments on chain, you could still take it through Square or whoever,
Yeah.
and you still, but
Or
you
using
still
like
have
layer 2 solutions. Or,
right. It's still there, yeah.
Which we hope we're, but we don't. I don't put that in the no they work bucket.
No.
Yeah.
And to answer the original question, this is obviously anecdotal, but we had one startup register over 1,200 names with us. And
Wow.
they were just so excited about the fact that they could make these records. And we had to explain to them, like, it's not a trademark unless people start, recognizing this as, being, indicating the services that are coming from your company. But they were just so excited to be able to, enumerate all of this, and said they would have never been able to afford this in the past. So we think that, with these types of systems that make, reduce friction and make things easier to understand, obviously we hope that it encourages people to create more.
But I would say, wouldn't that be a downside? Because not everything that one might think is a trademark is trademarkable, if that makes sense, or
so
patentable.
We're still operating within the existing system, so we're not saying, hey, this is the new trademark standard. We're saying whatever you're using, whatever rights you think you have, make a record of it here.
Okay.
And then if it's not enforceable, they say, okay, well, this is how I'm using it still. Or if it is, you can say, here, I have this clear history of, I've been using it since X date,
Right.
and here's all the times and places I've used it. So, it's very difficult to communicate that to people without a trademark background, obviously, and that's one of our biggest challenges, or it's our biggest challenge. But we see that as a positive, that it gets people thinking about themselves as trademark owners, and expanding the view of what they think of as their intellectual property or things that they might be able to protect. We obviously have to temper that with okay, not everything's protectable,
Right.
but whatever you are using, especially in the United States, you're using it in commerce, you can say that you have some level of protection there. But if not, it's clearly articulated what your rights are and what there aren't, and we hope it just adds sort of greater transparency to the overall system.
And as that relates to patents, the more visibility that's out there of all the patents that are in the world, the more an inventor could go to something like that and be able to do their own searches on innovation and technology to sort of make their own decisions about what they possibly could, invent or innovate.
Right, I can see that. Because I know that some of, Google has, I don't know how many patents, Facebook and them, they have so many patents. And I know that oftentimes they're buying off patents off of people, right? But they're also, submitting patent applications or trademark applications for people who didn't realize that whatever they had was actually patentable, but they got there first.
And
so
right,
they
well, that's
lose
because
out.
it's so expensive to
Right.
do that patent search, right? If there was
Right.
technology that could get them much closer to
Yeah,
what they
that's
were
what I'm saying.
inventing.